Hello, and welcome to my talk on how to use Waypoint to easily deploy to all three cloud providers. My name is Cassie Coyle. I'm a software engineer at HashiCorp, and there's my Twitter, GitHub, and website information for those of you that want it. As an overview, today we'll be going over what Waypoint is and how to use it. I'll be actually using it in the demos to deploy my app to AWS EKS, GCP GKE, and Azure AKS. And then, of course, we'll be going over some learnings because who doesn't have learnings along the way? Before I get into what I'll be talking about today, I wanted to preface that by going over a common problem we face as software engineers. Let's pretend I'm an application developer. I build apps. I want to build, deploy, and release my app, but occasionally get frustrated by the lack of consistency, say on my team and by other teams. You can build different ways. There's no standard between app tools. You can build with Docker and package the application and then publish the image to a container registry. One team may use Docker for testing and then Harbor, or another team may do it differently. Teams could even switch tools. And then on the deployment front, you could have different custom scripts per team, and you could deploy the container to Kubernetes or to ECS, and you have different plugin integrations. And then on the release front, you can't release cross-platform in the same way. There's just a lot of overhead. Now that we've looked at some of the common problems we face as software engineers with the build, deploy, and release phases of our applications, let's look into Waypoint and what it is, a solution to these problems. So Waypoint is a tool to deploy, manage, and observe your app through a consistent abstraction of the underlying infrastructure. And there's a great illustration below for you to see. Developers don't need to know the underlying infrastructure with Waypoint. Developers can write the app in the given language, say go. And then that middle layer, you use Waypoint and write an HCL file, and then you can deploy using Waypoint to a platform of your choosing. Waypoint supports many platforms, such as Kubernetes or ECS, to deploy applications. It is very easy to change the platform target as well. And a typical build, deploy, and release workflow could require many configuration files, but Waypoint handles the workflow in a single file called Waypoint.hcl. And here's another illustration where you can see we can build, deploy, and release your app using Waypoint in a consistent approach to delivering your app. So again, you don't need to know the underlying infrastructure. It's one consistent method and one HCL file. So here's a Waypoint HCL file example. It's very simple. You have your project XYZ, app hello world, and you have your build, deploy, and release stanzas. So the build stanza is to create an artifact from the application source code. There are a lot of supported artifact formats, such as container image, VM image, or whatever others. So you build your Docker image and store it into a remote registry, maybe hosted by Harbor, or use a Docker registry. The deploy stanza is to stage the created artifact onto the Kubernetes cluster. The artifact or the application is deployed in a deployment, but it doesn't receive traffic yet. And then the release stanza is to enable the deployment to expose the application. So the goal is to make the application ready to receive traffic. And getting into using Waypoint, typically you'll run, your Waypoint init first, and there's the output of what running that could look like. So it checks if your config files appear valid, connects to the Waypoint server, and then registers with the server your project and apps. And then, if you have pipelines, those are also registered with the server, and your project is initialized, you are good to run Waypoint up. So what that looks like is right here, kind of similar. So I grabbed a few snippets of what a Waypoint up looks like, but you can see the build, deploy, and release steps there. So I built my app through Kaneko, produced the Docker image, and pushed it. Kaneko, if you don't know, is an open source tool that allows users to create container images in their Docker file without root access. And then it deployed my app and released it. And we'll see that a little bit later on. I did want to note that I am specifically using HCP Waypoint over our open source version of Waypoint. It is currently in public beta and is a HashiCorp managed SaaS solution. And again, it is that continuous delivery tool that automates and simplifies the process of deploying your web applications into your infrastructure. And a benefit to using HCP Waypoint is that it allows you to manage your application lifecycle without maintaining a Waypoint server and the associated infrastructure. Now, I'll get into my 3 separate demos by showcasing some use cases you might have as a software engineer deploying your apps to 3 main cloud providers. Let's pretend I'm an application developer. I just finished building my app and I need to get it deployed to AWS EKS, but I don't really do this that often. I really do not want to write a deployment manifest and figure out how to get it all done. I did a bit of Googling to find a tool to solve this problem, Waypoint. I played around with Waypoint in my free time and decided to put it to use and write an HCL file to deploy my app to AWS. As a prerequisite, I did do a runner install. So Waypoint uses runners to execute operations. Every operation that Waypoint runs, say a build, deploy, and release, is executed by a runner. So the runner install is necessary as I want Waypoint to be able to deploy to my cluster. And I did, again, create this ahead of time, so we'll see that shortly. With the runner install, it does create a few resources in my cluster. So the runner itself lives as a pod, which I'll showcase. And the install command creates a service account and a role binding such that the runner can itself, along with an on-demand runner that it spins up, have cluster edit permissions to be able to deploy my app and such in my cluster. And we'll see the output in this slide. I have the ID as AWS and it's installing the runner. It uses Helm under the hood and then adopts the runner. Alrighty, let's get into it. So before I start, I will show you the Waypoint UI, where you can see I do not have any projects, but I can create some. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's my README for my repo. I had a few prerequisites, install the AWS CLI, set your credentials, create the cluster, and then update your kube config accordingly. So let's look at some of the code. Here's my server.go, starting server on port 5300. It's registering my hello service. I have a hello.proto with a message request and a message response with my hello service here, which takes in the message request and returns the message response. And here's that hello.go say hello method. And then I did write a little client just with, insecure credentials here. And then this is my auto-generated protobuf file. Okie dokie. And let's look at the Waypoint.hcl. So you can see here I have a project HashiTalk deploy AWS. I have my hello app AWS. It's using my runner profile, Kubernetes AWS. And then I have what is very similar to the PowerPoint slides, a build, deploy, and release stanza in my app. And of course, with some more config. So I'm using Docker and just some extra config I have in here, a variable image, which all the variables are defined below. I have my image, username, and password, which is grabbed from an environment variable. And I'm using a getref pretty for the tag, which returns the humanized version of the git hash. I ran into an issue later on that I'll discuss. That is why I chose to use getref pretty. And then I'm, setting credentials for authentication to push to the Docker registry. So username and password, and then deploy and release. Nothing too spectacular there. Let us go back to my handy dandy instructions. So, okay, let's take a look at my terminal. I have my runner install command here, the runner profile set with an environment variable as my Docker password, which I will not show, but you can see here, I have my kube config set with my AWS context. You'll see I have an alias set for K being kubectl, so bear that in mind. And I actually have a few Git aliases as well. But here's my runner pod up and running. And if I show you the role bindings, we'll see I have a runner role binding and an on-demand runner role binding such that they have cluster edit access to my cluster, and then the appropriate service account per runner and on-demand runner. This is my Waypoint runner list. I did create all of my runners in each cloud provider ahead of time. So here's my AWS one. It's of type remote. Here's my GCP and Azure, each with the different label. And then the runner profile list shows you that I have a corresponding runner profile per runner. So here's the AWS, GCP, and Azure that I reference in the HCL file with the appropriate runner target label here. I have my HCL file, I have my app, I have my kube context set. So let's go ahead and run a Waypoint init. So you see my project was initialized. If I do a git status, I don't have anything else to commit. So let's go ahead and update our project. After running the init, I can see my project there. So if I waypoint, if I inspect that project, you'll see I have my data set or my data source set to local. So I actually want to change that to reference my GitHub changes. So it's a project apply. It sets the data source to Git, sets the branch, and a few other things such that if I run this inspect again, you can see my Git URL, my Git ref, and the data source set. So remote is enabled now. So now that we have all of that, let's run a waypoint up. And you can see that it's cloning the data from Git using the information from the data source, has the URL, the branch, the Git commit, timestamp, and my lovely message tweaks to README. And it's building the app very similar to how it looked from my PowerPoint slide. And we'll just give this a few seconds to, do its thing. Great. It looks like it all went through. So if I scroll back up, you can see my build. The image was pushed. It's deploying my Hello app AWS and then releasing it. And so now if I run k git pods, ignoring the tasks, you can see a app created in this pod. So if I k logs that, through all of this, you can see starting server on port 5300. That looks familiar. Everything worked just fine. All I had to run was a waypoint up. So let's get back to the UI where I can showcase that from in here. You can see this is my Cassie Coyle org, and I'm looking at my HashiTalk deploy AWS project, which has one application, HashiTalk deploy AWS, with my deployment that's available and deployed. And then clicking on the deployment, you can see more information on it, build, deploy, release 1 minute ago, some operation logs, and resources. Super helpful and very clean to look at. Let's get back to the slides. Okay, so it's been a few months from my successful deployment, and I get an email saying that there's been a mandatory cutting of costs, and I'm to deploy my app to GCP GKE. And in my brief use of Waypoint, I know that I already have an app, I already have my HCL file, but I just need to tweak a few names and deploy my app to GCP. So it'd be the project name, the app name, and then switching my kube context. And disclaimer, I am by no means advocating for switching to GCP GKE to cut costs. This is a hypothetical reason for a hypothetical scenario. Again, you'll see I did a runner install into this cluster with the ID, GCP, and a corresponding label. Alrighty, let's get into the demo. Deploying my app to GCP GKE. So let's check out the README. Of course, there's some prerequisites. I had to install the gcloud CLI and create the cluster. And then we'll have to update my kube config. So let's just go ahead and do that now. Using my recursive search to use my GCP context. Great. Now if I can get pods, I can show you that I just have my one runner running in my cluster. Okay. Let's go ahead and configure Waypoint. So I already showed you my runner with the corresponding runner profile already there. We switched our kube context. So let's make those changes to the Waypoint.hcl file. Again, I'm going to leave all of my app, like server code and whatnot, the same. I'm not going to change that whatsoever, but I do actually want to use GCP instead. So we'll just update to use my GCP runner profile, this one here. You can see GCP, and then I want my app and project to have GCP in it, and that's all. I'm gonna do all the same steps, except, push those changes. So let's go ahead and do that. Here's my alias for get status. You can see the get diff. I just changed the name. So git add. We'll use GCP and then push. Great. Now that my code is pushed up, let's run a waypoint init. So now if I run a waypoint project list, we'll see I have a GCP project here. And again, I do want to do the same project apply just on my GCP project. So we'll go ahead and do that. My project is updated. So waypoint project inspect this project name. And it's all the same stuff with my get URL and ref. Okay. Now that that is done, let's run a waypoint up. And I'll give this a few minutes to go ahead and run in the background. So we can see here, I have two projects, a HashiCorp deploy AWS and a HashiCorp deploy GCP with a Hello App GCP. And it hasn't gotten to my deployments quite yet. Great. Now you can see the up was successful. You can see here my waypoint up operation was queued, waiting for job and waiting for runner assignment, cloning data from Git using the new commit message that I typed in. It's building the app, it's deploying the app and releasing my app, such that if I run git cods, you can see that I have another successful app deployed. And if I come over to the UI, then of course you can see more operation logs and such. Alrighty, so our second app was deployed to our second cloud. Let's get back and get into deploying into our third cloud. Alrighty, so it's been a few months. I get an email and I read that my CEO really likes the Azure stack. And, you know, we just acquired a new company that uses Azure quite a bit more than our current company. And since our CEO likes it so much, he wants there to be more cohesion between our companies. And now I'm told to deploy my app to Azure AKS. And by now, I'm a more seasoned Waypoint user. You know, I want to test out some more features. I realized that I want to do more than what like Waypoint Up provides for me, more than a build, deploy, release cycle. And I'm feeling more confident in myself and using Waypoint. I think I want to get a Slack notification if my app is deployed successfully. So let's go ahead and do that. You know, I did some Googling and came across pipelines. It is a newer feature on Waypoint, and it expands the build, deploy, release operations. So if you think about, what about testing after a build or running security scans? Using pipelines, I'm able to tell Waypoint what order to run operations. So for example, here is using pipelines to simulate Waypoint Up. So we have project, my project, you have pipeline full up with 3 steps, my build, my deploy, and my release, which each use the build, deploy, and release stanzas in my app. So pipelines is more configurable, and this is just a simple example of it. So let's expand that. Of course, I have another runner install, this time with the ID of Azure and into my Azure cluster. Let's get into that demo. So we'll pull up my handy dandy instructions, some prereqs. I did do an Azure login after installing the Azure CLI. You know, you get credentials for your cluster and set the kube config. And then the same steps. I already ran the runner install, did the runner profile set with my environment variable, and then we'll make changes. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's use my new cluster context, which is the Azure context, using my recursive search. Great, I am set to use my Azure cluster. Let's go ahead and add pipelines into our Waypoint.hcl file. Actually, before I add it, I'm going to, of course, update the project name, the app name, and my runner profile. Great, that says Azure. And now let's add in pipelines. So I have a pipeline here, deploy and notify, with 3 steps again, my build, which uses the build stanza, my deploy, which uses my deploy stanza, and a notify Slack step, which uses the exec plugin. So it's doing a curl against http stat.us/200, but imagine this is hitting Slack and not http stat.us, okay? Everything else will remain the same. We'll save that. Go back to my instructions. Okay, we'll add that. So git status, we will, well, I can do a git diff. So you'll see I just changed the names there and then added in the pipeline stanza. So let's git add, git commit, adding pipelines to Azure. Great. Oops, git push. Great. Now that that's already pushed, let's go ahead and run a waypoint init. Great. Projects initialized. My config file appears valid. And let us do the project apply again using my Azure project. So if I run a waypoint project list, you can see my 3 projects. And the project apply was again successful. And so this time I don't want to use waypoint up. I want to use waypoint pipeline run with my pipeline name. And I'm going to give that a few seconds to run as well. Great. Looks like my pipeline run was successful. 3 out of 3 steps successfully completed on my deploy and notify pipeline. So you can see here's some of the output. It was starting to run, cloning from Git. Then you can see here the build and then the deploy. And the run was complete. It was referencing my latest commit and everything was successful. If I pull up the UI, you can see that I have my Azure project with my Azure app that was successfully deployed here. And some, operation logs and so forth. Alrighty, so now that that's complete, we have successfully deployed to all of our cloud providers. Let's get back to the slides. And now that we have, gone through all of our demos, I will discuss our learnings. So a big thing that I learned was that Waypoint does assume that your infrastructure is set up. So it is super easy to use Waypoint. I showcased that, switching just a few letters to switch, and my kube context to deploying to a new cloud provider. And, you might have a platform team to provision the infrastructure for you. In my case, I didn't. I had to create the 3 sandboxes and the 3 different cloud providers, along with the 3 clusters, which wasn't as straightforward for each cloud provider as I was hoping it would be. So keep that in mind. On another note, something else I ran into was with Kubernetes caching. So when I was incrementally tweaking my app and whatnot, I was running Waypoint up, which would build my app through Kaneko. It would produce the Docker image and push it and then deploy my app. But then Kubernetes was seeing the same image name and the same image tag and then was using a cached version. So my pod was running, but never ready, and it was listening on an old port. And that was not the easiest to figure out, but that is why I used the git ref pretty. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about and seeing some of the capabilities that Waypoint provides through my demos. I encourage you to check it out for your own use cases. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of HashiTalks Deploy.